It's the 15th century, you're a noble knight and you're going into battle. How do you decide? Poleaxe or spear? It's Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm not a 15th century noble yet, although I'm kind of trying to work on it, thanks to the sponsors of this video who are established titles, but we're going to hear more about them later in the video. So the question we're looking at here is, for a 15th century knight, why might you choose a poleaxe? Why might you choose a spear? Now, the first thing to mention is I have noticed in recent weeks, when I have been talking about preparations for a certain living history reenactment event that I'm going to very soon, the Battle of Tewkesbury, with some friends of mine who you might recognise. We'll talk more about that in the future. But the question came up, why would I be using a spear if I was a knight? And I was somewhat surprised by this question. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before, but it seems that there is a certain group of people out there in the world who consider that for a real knight of the 15th century, this is really the only main primary weapon that they should be carrying. They wouldn't have a lowly spear, surely, would they? Well, they're wrong. Quite simply, the spear was absolutely a popular and prevalent, probably statistically more common than the poleaxe actually, primary weapon for knights in the 15th century. And yes, indeed, the poleaxe has lots of certain advantages, and it's a very iconic weapon and was preferred by some people, and certainly preferred in certain situations and contexts, but the fact is that the spear was still incredibly popular all the way up to the tops of nobility. So yes, indeed, whilst this is quite a posh weapon, and indeed certainly a poleaxe of this kind of design would be something usually carried by someone who has got enough money to have full harness and, you know, is essentially what we would call a knight. The spear, on the other hand, could be, theoretically, a basic spear could be carried by anyone in an army at that time. Despite that fact, the spear, not just used as a lance on horseback, but used on foot as a hand weapon, was absolutely a popular weapon for knights at this time. We find it in treatises, we find instructions on how to use it, just like we have instructions on how to use the poleaxe in treatises written for the nobility of the time. We also have instructions in treatises on how to use spears and other polearms, it has to be said as well. Moreover, if we look at period artwork, actually if we look at the manuscripts, we see that the fully armoured knights, if we call them that, even though they weren't all necessarily knighted, but all of the chevaliers, all of the knights, all of the ritter are very often carrying spears. Even in judicial duels, often we think of the poleaxe as a kind of fighting in the barriers, either for sport or for mortal combat in some cases. We often think of that as the dueling weapon for armoured knights, but oh no, the spear was also used as a dueling weapon. Sometimes it was thrown as part of the, particularly in Germany, as part of the kind of order of service, as it were, but not always. It was often used on foot as a fighting weapon to accompany the sword and the dagger. So if the spear was indeed very popular, and it was for knights in the 15th century, and the poleaxe was rather popular as well for knights in the 15th century, how did they choose? Why did they have both? And how would you choose which one to use in what kind of scenario? So what we're going to look at in this video are some advantages of the poleaxe first, and then we're going to look at some advantages of the spear second. So the first reason that a person might choose a poleaxe like this is because it displays their wealth and their status. In other words, it's a status symbol. It's like driving a Ferrari or a Lamborghini in a situation where that's not necessarily the most practical car to drive. For example, you're going to a wedding, you've got you know, your wife and maybe one of your kids that you've got to somehow squeeze in the back. It's not the most practical thing, but nevertheless, you want to look good at that wedding, so you've taken the Ferrari out of the garage and that's what you're going to drive there. So this is a status weapon. This is expensive. This is not the sort of weapon that just anybody on the battlefield in the 15th century could have necessarily afforded. And moreover, you've got to remember that there were very strict rules about who could wear what, who could own what in the medieval period. So some of you, I think, from a modern kind of a modern mindset would think, oh, well, surely, you know, you could loot one, you could get one. If you defeated a knight in combat, you could take a poleaxe and that would be your weapon, even if you were, you know, a miller or a tiler when you were back at home and you were maybe an archer on campaign, but you defeated a knight, you donked him on the head and you took his poleaxe. You wouldn't be allowed to keep it, I'm sorry to say. Society was very strict in those days. You weren't allowed to wear necessarily the types of shoes or the type of doublet or the type of coat that you wanted to. It was governed by your landowning status and your social station. So, a poleaxe like this exudes and oozes nobility, and I'm sure in some cases there were, you know, knights, or rather, should we say, lesser members of the gentry who invested in, because they might be commercially, they might be mercantile wealth, and they might have commercial success, and so they've got money. In some cases, they might have more money in their pocket than someone who's higher up the social ladder than them, and they might invest lots of money in a fancy poleaxe or fancy armour, or, you know, really cool plumes on their helmet of exotic birds or whatever, to really make it look like they were super posh. And so this could indeed imply things about your wealth on the battlefield, and possibly even increase your chances of survival, because remember, on the medieval battlefield, people with wealth were more likely to be kept and ransomed because they might be worth more alive than dead. So there are many social reasons why someone who could afford to would plough money into something like a poleaxe. And frankly, there's a lot of needless expense with a poleaxe. You could make a very simple axe and hammer with a spike at the top, made of wrought iron with some cleft welded or scarf welded hardened steel edge and point, and there you go, you're good to go. It still do the same job, but instead they go to huge lengths of decoration and perforations, and you know, look at the base of that spike here. Now, this is obviously a replica, but it gives you an idea of the sort of lengths that people went to in the 15th century to make a weapon look really fancy. So the first element to consider here is that the poleaxe is high status, and because of its constructional style, can imply a lot of things about your wealth and position. Now, the next point to consider is that if you are an armoured knight, this is actually a rather appropriate weapon for you to carry, because it's a two-handed weapon, so you can have well-gauntleted hands, perhaps certain types of mitten gauntlet or sometimes half mitten gauntlet, so you can spread your hands far apart, you can get a good grip on the weapon, you've got a good amount of leverage on it, but it's not too long and unwieldy, and moreover, because it's shorter, you can use both ends. And in poleaxe treatises, we see the back end used extensively, not just for offensive but also for defensive actions, as well as the top end, or what a lot of people would think of as the business end. In actual fact, a lot of the business is done with this end as well. I've looked at the poleaxe in previous videos, and I've pointed out the fact that you've got a upper portion up here, you've got a middle of the shaft, demi-hache in French, and then you've got the tail, or the queue, down here, and each of those parts can be used for different defensive or offensive actions. And in armour, this weapon, for you using it, if you're the person in armour, this makes a certain amount of sense. Now, if you're in armour fighting against lesser armoured people, you've got to bear in mind you've got a lot of offensive possibilities with this weapon. It might have a hammer or a spike on one side, it's usually got a hammer or a axe on the other side, it has a top spike and it has a bottom spike, and that means that if you're fighting against multiple opponents where you're fully in armour and they might be in partial armour or no armour in some cases, you can engage multiple opponents in multiple directions very quickly and easily to protect yourself, because one of the risks when you're a knight in armour, if we're going to term it like that, is you being wrestled to the ground by multiple opponents who might be less well equipped or less trained or anything else, or less armoured than you. But the fact is, if you're one person fighting against four opponents, then they can literally jump on you and pull you to the ground. This sort of weapon helps defend against that, because it can fight in very close range and is relatively quick to turn around, and can offend in many, many different ways, as well as defending in many ways as well. Now, the final major advantage of the poleaxe, which is very closely related to the previous point, is previously I mentioned that this is great, of course, at defending yourself if you are fully armoured. It's particularly suited to the needs of that. But equally, it is particularly well suited, surprise, surprise, to fighting against someone else who is in full armour. So put aside the multiple lightly equipped opponents now, and now your opponent standing in front of you is just like you. They're in full plate harness in the 15th century. And the only real gaps, apart from just hitting them really, really hard, the only really gaps you've got to get into are things like armpits, open face if they've got an open face helmet, insides of the elbows, back of the gauntlets, back of the legs, crotch, this type of thing. So in that situation, this is a particularly well adapted weapon because, of course, we've got various types of piercing and smashing heads just for hitting the person really, really hard. We've got a long, narrow shank, which is quite similar in many, many ways to a rondelle dagger point on the end of your shaft. Usually, this one doesn't, but usually you have a spike on the back end as well. So both ends can be used in close range as a short spear, and you could say they're the primary weapons actually, despite the fact you've got this big axe on a hammer or a spike or whatever. Actually, the top and bottom spikes are pretty much what's used most of the time. You've got an axe blade, which you can, of course, if it is an axe blade, you can use it against people who are more lightly equipped, and that's probably the best thing to use against them. But you can still, of course, hit someone who's in armour really, really hard with this, or if there's a spike. So you can just bash them really hard. Now, because this is a comparatively heavy weapon compared to a spear anyway, or a sword, and it's top heavy. So that does mean that if you're predominantly using the back end like a spear and like a spike, looking for openings, trying to jam it in the face and the armpit and this kind of stuff, it does mean that your hitting head is back, such that when you do hit, you've got an enormous amount of inertia. And bear in mind, as I've talked about in previous videos, you can slide the hand down. So you can either keep the hand at the top for more control and repeated blows in different locations, or you can slide that top hand down to get greater reach and greater power, greater impact power. So the other thing to mention is hooking as well, hooking and pushing. So this type of weapon, unlike a spear which spends almost all of its time with the point forward, or sometimes if that gets pushed aside, the other point forward, this weapon can often be held with the shaft essentially in front of the body in something like guardia di alto, as the Italians would call it, or vomtag, or pretty much one of the standard guard positions of le jeu de la hache, which is a Burgundian poleaxe treatise. A lot of the time the weapon, because it can turn much more quickly than the spear because it's shorter, it can be in front of you. So this is also used for hooking and pushing. So pushing can be done with the end here, what's called the cross, le croix. For example, if you place one of these branches into the opponent's pauldron or armpit, you can push them away. It's done against the breastplate and even against the helmet. You can hook towards you, you can pull the person's armour or their arms or their legs towards you. So it can hook, it can bash, it can spike. It's got so many options. And fighting against someone in the 15th century in full plate harness is really hard. Finding an opening, finding a way to overcome them one-on-one is very, very difficult. And this is probably the weapon which gives you the greatest number of options. So that's really one of the reasons, I think, why so many people consider the poleaxe as the armoured knights, the late medieval armoured knights weapon par excellence, because it's so specialised for their use, both for them to use and to use against other similar people who are equipped and armoured like themselves. What's that noise? It's not what I think it is it? Am I being summoned to become a lord? What's this? It's not. It is. It's the proclamation. I am now Lord Easton. Lord Matthew John Easton, hereafter referred to as the Lord, has by way of notice this 2nd day of July in the 2nd year 2022, in the 70th year of the reign of our sovereign lady Elizabeth II, but delivered unto us the intention to purchase, and us with the intention to accept, established titles has agreed with the Lord, so bequeath unto them a dedication of a plot of land of precisely 1 foot square in Scotland. That's right, I'm now a laird in Scotland. So Established Titles has worked out this fantastic system whereby through them you can purchase 1 foot square of land. You can't build very much on that, in fact you can't build anything on it at all, but you can purchase 1 foot square of land in Scotland, and under very particular rules that grants you the right to refer to yourself as the laird or lady of that particular piece of land. You know, I'm thinking this would make a great gift at Christmas or Mother's or Father's Day. Now, it just so happens that I am part Scottish, but absolutely anybody out there can take advantage of this amazing system. When you order this through Established Titles, you get at least 1 foot square of land in Easton in Scotland, and you get your own individualised certificate with a lovely little crest on it down there. You get a real, tangible, exact plot number, and you can actually see where your bit of land is. Established Titles have also made a pledge that with every single order they will plant a tree somewhere. So you're also helping the world, you're helping the environment when you place your order. This makes an amazing last minute gift. Established Titles is actually running a massive sale right now. Plus, if you use the code SCHOLA10, specifically for viewers of my channel, then you can get an additional 10% off the price. So go to establishedtitles.com/scholar10 to get your gifts now and help support my channel. So thanks very much to Established Titles for sponsoring this video. Now, when you are a lord, or indeed if you become a 15th century knight somehow, are you going to be carrying a poleaxe, or might you carry a spear? Well, let me tell you about some of the features of the spear. Now, it's no news to regular viewers of this channel that I absolutely bloody love spears. They're fantastic things. This is actually a spear that I've most recently made up. It's got an octagonal shaft. It's got a beautiful head that was forged for me in Poland with a very stiff cross section. This is a blunt one for reenactment. In fact, it was a sharp one, but I've chopped the point off and made it blunt. And it's a very robust type of spear. And this type of spear was the type of spear used by all types of soldier pretty much in the 15th century. Now, I just want to reiterate the point that yes, indeed, this is seen in the hands of lowly foot soldiers, common infantry, however you want to view them, militias in some cases, but it was absolutely also carried and used by knights and in some cases the highest nobility. Now, we're going to very briefly talk about the fact that this is interchangeably a lance or a spear. I'll talk more about that as we go along, but fundamentally this could be the same object, and we do absolutely sometimes in art see people fighting on foot with a spear that has a stop on it that goes against the runs up against the lance rest and prevents it from being rammed through the person's armpit. So, but sometimes they're fighting on foot with them. So they are interchangeable. Now, you may be familiar with jousting lances, and they are a very particular thing, heavy lances, and they were used in war as well, obviously with a sharp point instead of a coronel. So heavy lances were used. However, lances that were more like spears were also used on horseback. These were sometimes known as a demi-lance, sometimes as a lance-gay. But fundamentally, and sometimes even just referred to as spears, even when used on horseback. So fundamentally, there's a big variety, but what we're primarily talking about here is a spear like this, a fairly typical 15th century spear, and they were, as I've spoken about in previous videos, the heads were adapted and evolved in this period to deal with the armour of the day. They're very robust, very reinforced, completely rigid points designed for stabbing into gaps in armour and indeed in some cases into mail armour or potentially even into plate armour and things like brigandines itself as well. So the first advantage of the spear that I want to sell you on, but I probably won't need to because you're probably already sold on it, is it's really long. Look how long it is. Look how long my weapon is. It's reach, okay? Reach is a really big advantage a lot of the time. It can be in individual combat, it can be in massed combat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. But fundamentally, reach isn't always what you want, and if we just go back to the poleaxe for a second, I talked about the fact that it's certainly fighting in armour, or sometimes fighting against people in armour, you sometimes want to get in close. Now, if you're fighting in close, then clearly there are other weapons which are going to be advantageous over the spear. If you're really, really close, then a rondel dagger is probably going to be the the right weapon for the job. But remember that a 15th century knight at this time would traditionally have a polearm of some kind, a poleaxe or a spear or something like that. Then they would have a sword, then they would have a dagger, and of course they can wrestle. And they've got their armour, and they can use their armour for punching and kneeing and elbowing and this kind of stuff. So they have the ranges covered, but by having a longer primary weapon, by having a longer spear in this case, it does mean that if you are primarily, or initially should we say, fighting against someone who's got, say, a poleaxe, you outranged them. You are going to be putting hits on them, and this doesn't involve necessarily wounding with every hit. A hit, remember, against someone in armour can push them away. So you can keep them at bay, you can keep them at distance in single combat. So you can hit them before they can reach you. Okay, so having longer reach is advantage in some situations there. But if we look at massed combat as well, then if you've got 100 men with spears versus 100 men with poleaxes, well, clearly the 100 men with poleaxes are not going to be able to hit the 100 guys with spears until they've closed in to close range. And closing at close range, is the spearman useless? No, you can still use the spear in close range in a number of ways. You can slip it back and still launch thrusts here. You can turn it here and use the middle end to push away, or you can turn it completely around and use the back end. Or, as I've just mentioned, you can drop the spear and pull your sword out or your dagger out. So you've always got backup weapons when you're a medieval knight. So the spear having greater reach, yes, in some situations that can be a disadvantage because you've got a longer, more unwieldable weapon. For example, fighting in a building or something like that. Or indeed if someone closes in on you. But remember that if that happens, you can always just drop the spear and pull out your sword or pull out your dagger. So fundamentally, I would say the primary and most obvious advantage of the spear, in armour or out of armour, even though armour mitigates this, is nevertheless the main advantage is that you have added reach. Now, as I've already mentioned, this can be used on horseback, and in some situations the very same spear or lance that's used on horse can be the same one that's used on foot. We find references to French knights dismounting at Poitiers in 1356, and that's one of the earliest references to it, to them shortening their lances to spears, and presumably they had people just chop them off, or they, I don't know, snap them off. They don't really go into details. And this is in Froissart's Chronicles, and it says that they shortened the lances and fought with them on foot as spears and advanced as infantry, largely because of the English longbows and the fact that the horses were going to get shot to pieces. So absolutely you can take your lance and use it on foot as a spear. We see this in Fiore de Liberi's treaties. We actually see where they have knights in full armour fighting with spears, and you can see that some of the spears are actually lances from the form of them and the details of them. However, it can go the other way around as well. So if you are primarily intending to fight on foot, and if I had this spear, say for example, I'm in, the Wars of the Roses, and I'm in the Yorkist army, and the Lancastrians start to flee, okay? If the Lancastrian army starts to flee, I'm on foot, I call for my valet to come as quickly as possible with the horse. I don't have to go and fetch another weapon to pursue the fleeing Lancastrians on horseback. I've already got one in my hand. Now, obviously I could, if the only thing I've got in my hand is a sword, I could absolutely pursue them on horseback to cut down routing enemies with a sword on horseback. However, swords don't have very long reach, and as we know, depending on the size of your horse, opponents in history have been noted to sometimes just lie down when faced with cavalry with swords, and the person with the sword can't reach them from the top of the horse. And so in those cases, lances are very useful. Moreover, the people who are running away might still be armed. They might still be fighting, and they want to survive. And they might still be armed with things like bills or poleaxes or other spears. So therefore, having the additional reach of a spear, there is no reason on earth why I can't use this spear on horseback. And for most situations, it's going to have a lot more reach and have a lot more penetrative power, be a lot more fatal than a sword blow when used from horseback. So it can go either way around. The mounted man can dismount and use their lance as a spear. The foot combat knight can mount up on a horse to pursue the enemy and just use his spear as a lance. Now you might say, well, what about the poleaxe? Why is that a disadvantage for the poleaxe? Quite simply, folks, it's probably quite obvious. This ain't a great weapon to have. It's very top heavy. Now, could you couch this under the arm and use it like a lance at a push? But it's pretty lumpen, and it's not very long. It doesn't give you much reach. Certainly it's got a massive reach advantage over against a lance or a spear, but it's also just very top heavy. It's not very well suited to it. You'd almost be better off with a sword, I think, on horseback. So do we ever see these in art used on horseback? Yes, occasionally, but it's pretty rare. So the spear, very versatile, and without having to change weapons means you can fight on horse, on foot, bam, like that, same weapon in your hand. Now this is a point that I think that fewer people will have necessarily thought about, and that is when you're using a spear, it is more useful on foot against a mounted opponent than a poleaxe is. Now it's not to say that a poleaxe or any other weapon isn't usable against mounted opponents, it is. We have, even in treatises, we have advice on how to use a sword against a mounted opponent. But the fact is that the longer your weapon is, it comes back to reach again, the longer your weapon is, the easier it is to engage the mounted opponent, especially when the mounted opponent has a lance or spear. So ideally what you really want is a weapon that is at least as long reaching as the mounted person's lance, and preferably longer. A pike. Now pikes are something that come around at the end of the medieval period. However, they are so long that a lot of the disadvantages that come with reach of a spear are become even more exacerbated. And although pikes were used in single combat for a particular type of tournament fighting, overall they are mass formation weapons, whereas the spear can function, because it's shorter and more wieldable, it can function as a massed weapon, a massed ranks weapon, or it can operate as an individual combat weapon. So against a mounted opponent, a spear is much more advantageous over the poleaxe. I wouldn't want you to come away with the impression that the poleaxe is useless against a mounted opponent. I'd still say a poleaxe is far more useful than a sword, for example, because you've got much greater leverage, much greater reach, and you've got this portion, the cross, the le croix, that's able to push against the opponent's horse or riding equipment, things like the legs of the rider, or even the stirrups, perhaps even the reins. And of course you can offend the horse. You don't have to attack the man, you can attack the thing he's riding. But fundamentally, overall, certainly if I was fighting someone who had a lance on horseback, I would far rather have a spear that I can jam into the front of the horse than a poleaxe, because I'll be able to do it from further away and not get hit, hopefully not get hit by their lance. Additionally, and on another point, if we look at Fiore's treatise, or even in Talhofer, we do see techniques where lances and spears are used to parry an incoming lance or spear. And in Fiore, we even have this with lance versus lance on horseback. And that's a similar thing. If the opponent's coming in at me with a lance, I have a greater margin for error with a long spear to defend against that incoming lance than I do with a poleaxe, because the poleaxe is shorter. Now this next point, again, I think is not necessarily something that people would immediately think of, but looking at the treatises we get the answer, and that is that sometimes these things, although these big, sturdy, thick, heavy spears that we see in use in the 15th century are not that well catered to it, can be thrown. And I can throw this a fair distance. You know, you've seen me throw pila and things like this on video. I can throw a spear okay, and I can throw this far enough such that if I need to throw this at an opponent who is maybe 10-20 meters away, I can throw it fairly accurately and it'll hit with a lot of force. I can throw a poleaxe. However, it's really badly designed for it for a number of reasons. The balance is just all wrong, it's very top heavy, it's overall about twice the weight, maybe even 3 times the weight of the spear. So this is poor as a throwing weapon, whereas obviously, because javelins have been a thing since ever, the spear, even a big, thick, heavy spear like this, even something like a boar spear, which is really at the top end of heavy spears, you can throw it at least at short range, pretty accurately, and it will go pretty straight and it will penetrate whatever it hits. So the final point I want to cover, the advantage for the spear, is that fundamentally it can also be used more conveniently and more easily in formations. Now, knights at this time weren't necessarily exactly in the exact same sort of formations as something like, you know, spearmen or billmen or pikemen, But that being said, they were mixed in with these other men-at-arms. So the fact is that whilst knights did often have poleaxes and did often use poleaxes, presumably when they were in a tight press, and this is conjecture because we actually don't know an awful lot about this, but presumably when they were in a tight formation and a tight press, a lot of the time they were pretty much limited to how they could use their poleaxe. You can't necessarily start swinging it around like this like you would in single combat, because you've got people on either side of you and behind you. You know, if I go into the guard from Le Jeu de la Hache, which has the tail forward, and do this, I'm going to smash the guy behind me in the face with the really sharp and heavy pointy end of my poleaxe. So the ways that you want to use a poleaxe and the way that poleaxes are shown being used in the treatises is somewhat problematic to use in a squished in body of troops, whereas very clearly spears are not, because the way that the knight would use the spear is the same way as everyone else uses a spear or a pike, predominantly with the point forward and keeping the enemy at bay and stabbing them a lot. So I would say overall this is a weapon which is better suited to massed ranks, massed fighting than the poleaxe. And I suspect, going to the medieval art, if we look at the proportions of knights carrying spears versus the proportion carrying poleaxes, not to say poleaxes are rare in medieval art at all, they're actually quite common, but they are not as common as spears. Whenever we see massed bodies of troops, not common troops, but people in armour, when we see massed bodies of knights in medieval art, they usually have spears, even when on foot. So to conclude, I don't want you to think that I'm just a massive spear fanboy, even though I kind of am a massive spear fanboy. I also love poleaxes, and I recognise they just have different strengths to each other. They've got different advantages. So how would you choose? Well, I think it's really, really difficult. And one of the most important things, I'm not going to say how you necessarily choose. I'm going to give you some ideas and you can think about it for yourselves. But the thing I really want you to note is you can't have both unless you happen to have a servant running around after you with a pair of coconuts, not a pair of coconuts, no, with a poleaxe, spare poleaxe or a spare spear, so you can switch over like a golf caddy. But if you don't have that to hand immediately, then by and large, you're either going to have to choose before the combat starts or before you move into the front lines or move into your whichever battle, as they call it, whichever section, unit you're in. At that point, you're going to have to decide which of these two weapons you take. And I think it's going to be governed by all sorts of things. Are you likely to be fighting in buildings? If we look at the Battle of St. Albans, for example, Wars of the Roses, then indeed, the close-in fighting in narrow medieval streets and in buildings through windows, we actually know, I think it was Salisbury or Somerset, I can't remember which, was killed with a poleaxe in the head because he stuck his head out of a window in St. Albans and got a poleaxe in the head. So fighting this kind of very built up, and remember urban and suburban areas in the 15th century were very closely built. Streets were narrow, cobblestoned, or sometimes just mud track, and the buildings were closely packed together, and the buildings were small, low ceilings, low doorways, stuff like this. So in a confined situation, definitely the poleaxe is a better weapon, but in a big open field where you might be attacked by cavalry in the flanks, where you don't have hedgerows or ditches or rivers to protect you necessarily, I think the spear's going to be a better weapon for the most part. But it also depends on who your opponents are, not just the landscape, not just the buildings, but also, are your opponents, is there going to be lots of cavalry, or are they going to be coming in on foot? Are they huge numbers of lightly equipped militias, or are they a small number of heavily armoured professional knights and men-at-arms? All of these sorts of things dictate it, and I think, you know, if you're going to be fighting against massed opponents, and you're going to be fighting in ranks, depending on their armour levels, one of these might be better than the other. What do you think? How would you choose between a poleaxe and a spear? And I don't think you should be afraid either to just say, oh, I'd choose a poleaxe, because they just look badass. Because honestly, medieval people were just as susceptible to that kind of stuff. I mean, you only have to look at their fashion sense to see that. They were just as susceptible to what looks cool, the rule of cool, as we are now. So sometimes they just chose a weapon because it looked more badass, it looked more expensive, looked more impressive, I guess, than a simple, humble spear. But honestly, For most fights on foot, most of the time I'd probably take the spear and have a good sword for a backup if things got too close, and obviously a rondel dagger. You never want to be out without one of those. But there we go. Hope this has been thought-provoking. Always interested to see your thoughts and opinions below. Check out the established titles offer, because it's a good fun thing, and you know, however seriously or not you want to take the whole thing, it might be a good present for someone that will make them laugh at Christmas time or their birthday or something. So check out those links below. As always, please give the video a like, share it around, and if you're not subscribed, why the hell not? Please do so right now. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.